Hello everybody and welcome on in. Today I wanted to talk about the split stat changes that were proposed on the PTR but ended up getting removed in this last PTR patch. I wanted to take a bit of an objective look at these changes and talk a little bit about what kinds of builds changes like this can affect, how these changes could have a huge impact on buildcraft, and of course whether or not people will need to replace their current best in slot gear if a change like this ends up going through. Now, people have had all kinds of opinions about these changes. Some people really like them, some people really don't like them. I'd love to hear what you guys think, and I'm going to do my best to give you just kind of a rundown of what these changes will impact. So starting off, we have to take a look at the new split stat gear itself. Here you can see on the rapier we've got focus and intelligence for a total of 35 attribute points, compared to the solid attribute of intelligence here only giving a maximum of 30 attribute points at 600 gear score, of course. So as you can see, split stat attributes are going to be gaining 5 additional attribute points over the solid stat ones, and if you have a full set of split stat attributes, you can look forward to gaining 50 more attribute points in total than you had before. Now, there are some limitations to the split stat. For example, if the split stat has Constitution in any of the splits, you do not gain any additional attribute points. It is only specifically for the offensive attributes that you will get the bonus for your split stats. As you can see here, the rapier has 10 points in intelligence as its off stat. So if you have a full set of split stat equipment, you will have a minimum of 100 points invested into an off stat or various different off stats. So let's take a look at the attribute points to explain this a little bit better. As you guys can see, I've got a full intelligence build with Constitution here. If we go for a split stat setup instead, we would be losing 100 points of intelligence, and that would be turned into any of the off stats of our choice. I'm going to go with dexterity because I have a rapier on this build, so it makes the most sense scaling wise. And then we're going to be gaining those 50 additional bonus stats that we get for going for the split stat gear. Now, because I don't have that actual gear on the public test realm, I'm just going to take 50 points out of Constitution, and we'll pretend that I have the gear and pretend that I still have the 150 points in Constitution here, just so I can show you guys this example. So those 50 points can then be allocated wherever you want. I'm going to put them back into intelligence so you guys can see the direct trade-off of 50 points of intelligence for 100 points in dexterity. Obviously, if you're using a weapon like the rapier, the new split stat gear makes a lot of sense and is arguably best in slot for outgoing damage. So the split stat change is a big buff to any weapon that has a dual scaling attribute. Now, let's say you're playing just an intelligence build like Fire Staff and Ice Gauntlet. How much do you benefit from going for the split stat? Well, since an intelligence build won't benefit from investing into any other attribute, it's really about choosing whether or not that split stat gives you any good jump points in the 50 or 100 jump point range that make a lot of sense for your build. So with the Fire Staff intelligence setup, I think what makes the most sense if I was to try something like this is 50 points in dex and 50 points in focus for the ability cooldown reduction and the 10% increased chance to critical hit. So in this case, the trade-off here is 50 points of intelligence for the 2 jump points of dexterity and focus, and that's really all that you benefit from it. So unless these jump points are super important for a particular build, I think if you're using a primary intelligence and constitution build, going for the split stat isn't actually a better option, and the current gear you have on the live server will still remain best in slot. So now let's talk about builds that aren't really viable right now, but the split stat changes make them a lot more viable than they used to be. And that's when you mix 2 weapons together that don't have the same scaling. For example, Ice Gauntlet and Great Axe, one scaling from strength and the other scaling from intelligence. With the changes to the split stat gear, you're going to be able to gain 50 more points in your off stat than you used to get, meaning that this split is going to be a lot more viable than it used to be, especially since the first 100 points that you put into a stat are not going to be affected by diminishing returns. Now in this particular build, of course the Great Axe isn't going to hit as hard as a 300 strength Great Axe setup will, but if you balance out the intelligence a little bit more, you can start to see that we start to get a lot more competitive stats between intelligence and strength than we did in the previous patch. And thanks to the changes on the jump points too, this build starts to look a lot more viable than it used to. Now, are these builds going to be viable coming into this new patch? I don't really know. I really hope that Amazon can do everything in their power to make changes like this, because I do think that this is a huge step in the right direction for Buildcraft, encouraging people to try different and unique setups and actually making them viable where they weren't really before. So in conclusion, I think the addition of the split stat attributes is going to be huge for build crafting, especially since they buffed the 50 jump points for a lot of the different attributes here. The split stat attributes start to give you a lot of build craft options that just weren't as good before. And finally, I really like how this change adds more viability to the weird weapon combos that some people like to run and maybe aren't as viable because they don't align well with the attribute scaling. And I think it adds a lot of complexity to Buildcraft, especially when you're mixing two weapons like Rapier and Hatchet that have dual scaling attributes but not in the same attributes. There are a few select builds where I think the split stat will feel like a direct buff to them, and that's if you're using weapons like, let's say, Spear and Hatchet together, both of them scaling from Strength and Dexterity. Now, this is something that is a little concerning for me, and it could cause these weapons to feel a little bit overtuned, but the weapon powers could always be adjusted to be brought back in line to where they were before compared to the other single stat weapons, and that might be a viable way to keep the split stat changes going forward without buffing these weapons too much. But for the most part, the split stat change just adds options that weren't there before, and it even adds value to some pretty previously undesirable pieces of gear. As always, I would love to hear what you guys think about the new split stat changes, whether you think it's good for the game, bad for the game. Let me know down in the comments section below. I, for one, am very excited for this new patch to hit the live server. Outside of the split stat attributes, there are so many huge changes coming with this patch that really open up build crafting as well. I think in general, in New World, putting your character together and putting a build together is going to be a lot more fun and involved than it used to be. I've got links to my Twitch if you guys want to catch some live gameplay, and a link to my Twitter if you guys want to keep up to date with me. You can check out my website, pvpnewworld.com. It's got written guides for my builds as well as a bunch of information on the game. And I would love to put out another episode of the New World Top 5 Battles. If you guys have some awesome fights that you want to see some commentary over and featured on the channel, you can send them to Kristofer at pvpnewworld.com. This show is sponsored by What the Fast, a VPN for gamers that can give you better ping to your favorite games, especially if you have poor ping to start. There's a link down below for you guys. It's free to try for the first month. And last but not least, a massive thank you to all of my patrons on Patreon. Thank you guys for supporting the show. Thank you everybody for tuning in and watching. As always, I hope you guys are looking forward to more, and I'll see you guys next time. Have a great night, everybody.